Okay, hello, good morning. Welcome to the seminar of the Neuro-COGNiMATH group in its second season. Today, we are honored to have the participation of Dr. Rebecca Merkley from the Institute of Cognitive Science at Carleton University. And before introducing our guests, I want to thank all the support you have given us on all these activities. We are very close to the end of this second season. 2020 has been a year of many challenges and difficulties. In this sense, that we are very grateful to all our speakers for their support in this noble cause, generating an international seminar that will allow us to get closer in moments that we are far apart. Therefore, Rebecca, and to all our speakers, thank you very much for everything. Through these years, we have worked intensely to bring these different activities, the object of which is to contribute to your education as psychology professionals. We sincerely hope that we can continue to carry out this noble work for all of you. To my students of the Neuro-COGNiMATH group, all my appreciation and admiration. I will always be proud of you, and reaching where we have arrived wouldn't have been possible without you. And today's talk will be spectacular. The subject is fascinating and crucial. Rebecca's work in this line of research is fantastic and essential, and it is an honor for us to have her here today. And Rebecca, thank you very much for this opportunity that you gave us to share your knowledge and experience. My entire admiration for you and your wonderful career. And I thank you for your kindness and support. And without further ado, allow me to introduce our guest with a brief summary of her career. So, Professor Rebecca Merkley is an assistant professor at the Institute of Cognitive Science at Carleton University. She obtained her PhD in experimental psychology at the University of Oxford, her master's degree in mind, brain, and education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and her BA in psychology in the University of Western Ontario. She did a postdoctoral stay at the Brain and Mind Institute in the University of Western Ontario. She had a lot of professional honors and awards, a lot of publication and work presented in Congress and conferences. And also she has been participating as a consultancy and contract research at the International Science and Evidence-Based Education Assessment, the UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education of Peace and Sustainable Development, and as an expert contributor at the FF Plus Math program and the Behavioral Insight team at the TIC app. She have been reviewing left several journals as Cognition, Neuropsychology, the Journal of Educational Child Psychology, and a lot more journals. So thank you very much, Rebecca, for this great opportunity to have you here. And the stage is all yours. Thank you very much, Rebecca. Welcome to the Cognitive Math group.
Wow, thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and also for inviting me here today. It's a privilege to be able to talk about this work. I'm hoping this session can be pretty interactive, so please feel free to ask any questions in the chat or make any comments, and I'll pause for questions a few times throughout, although we'll leave most of the discussion for the end. I've also flagged Twitter handles of my collaborators on my slides throughout, so if you're interested in finding out more, you can follow them if you use Twitter, and you're also welcome to contact me. So I have my contact information at the end if you want to get in touch. And I study the cognitive development of children's mathematical thinking and its reciprocal relationship with early childhood education. My focus is on the early years in particular, as it's important to set children up with strong foundational cognitive skills and positive attitudes towards math learning. And I started off studying cognitive development from a psychological and cognitive neuroscience perspective, but I've always wanted to do work that's relevant to education and teaching. And so I did an interdisciplinary master's program, as you mentioned, in neuroscience and education to better understand how to make connections between cognitive science research and classroom practice. And one of the highlights of my job is spending time in early childhood classrooms because I learned so much from students and teachers. I think researchers and educators have a lot to learn from each other, and I'm therefore really interested in building and maintaining research practice partnerships. Today, I'm going to tell you about 2 research projects on early math learning and assessment that have come about via these partnerships. So one robust finding from cognitive research in early childhood is that children's number knowledge measured in preschool, so typically before the age of 5 years old in the US, UK, and Canada, predicts formal math achievement longitudinally. And importantly, children need to know a lot about numbers. It's not enough to be able to recognize that this is the number 3. Children have to know that 3 refers to sets of this many objects, and also know that 3 comes after 2 and before 4. And despite how important foundational math skills are, early childhood educators are not consistently given much guidance around early math, especially compared to, say, literacy, for example. And this is something we heard from educators in nurseries in Oxfordshire, England. We recently completed a longitudinal study looking at cognitive and educational foundations of preschool math. And as part of this project, we observed the types of math language that the preschool educators were using in the classroom. And as you can see from the figure, there was high proportions of math language or math talk around counting and cardinality, but less so about ordering and place value and other aspects of number knowledge. And many of the educators we worked with mentioned the lack of specific training they had for math, both within their qualifications and in their continuing professional development. And they expressed a desire for more training around how to support early math learning. And so Megan von Spreckelsen led on this aspect of the project, looking at math language, and she also interviewed some of the educators that participated in the project about their experiences in being involved in research. And largely, the people we interviewed found it a positive experience, and here's a quote to illustrate that from a participant, that whether she would seek involvement in more research in the future, she said it's a win-win. We can only learn more. I want to show you a brief clip of one of these interviews.
I was just really excited at the opportunity of working with researchers from Oxford University. That sounded very exciting. I just finished my degree not long before, so I was just really excited about the possibility of what we could find out, what we could learn, what you could bring to us, and just being part of the project. So it worked really well at my previous setting, and then when I came here in September, I was really keen that we carried it over here. We could hear a lot of things that were going on, so we did learn quite a lot about where our children were within their mathematical development in ways that we wouldn't have thought of anyhow. So in terms of building up their profile, it was really useful. But also there were things that certainly made me think, well, I didn't even think that was maths as well.
Definitely.
And the questionnaires and things. So it's broadened our outlook as well.
And so an educator participating in the project remarked that by observing the different games that the researchers played with children, they learned a lot about their students' mathematical development. And so this is helpful for teachers to know kind of where their students are at in their development of mathematical understanding. And it was reassuring to hear that the ways in which we as researchers assess students' mathematical thinking could potentially also be useful for early years educators. And this has inspired other projects investigating more specifically how results from research in mathematical cognition could be useful for educators. And so as a researcher, I lack expertise around early years pedagogy. So a key aspect of these projects was to work with educators to determine whether and how research could be used in early math classrooms. We want to talk about 2 research projects about early math teaching and learning. And like I said, I'll pause after each one in case you have any clarification questions about the specific study. And then I'll sum up and talk about some work in progress and leave time for discussion. So again, please feel free to post comments and questions. So this first project was a continuing professional development project with some early years teachers. And number symbols are sometimes considered to be more formal math, but we've argued that symbols can be incorporated into playful activities. And this has the dual benefit of introducing concepts and also encouraging positive attitudes toward math. And so in this first project, we wanted to test whether sharing findings from research in mathematical cognition with early years teachers and then working together to co-design playful math activities for the classroom could then positively impact their students' math achievement. I want to say a little bit about the Ontario early math curriculum. I imagine it might be different from Mexico. And actually, the province of Ontario, so in Canada, each province has its own Ministry of Education and kind of sets the standards. And so the province of Ontario, where I live and work, recently rolled out a new math curriculum. And what's interesting about this curriculum is that it focuses on different content areas in math, such as geometry and spatial skills, and then number knowledge, but it also incorporates social emotional learning. And it's really great that this has been recognized as an important aspect of math learning as well. So the curriculum is set by the Ministry of Education in Toronto, but school boards have to implement it. This is part of where this gap is between, teachers and school boards are given a curriculum, but not necessarily given support on how to do it in their classroom. And this is sometimes somewhere where research can help. And so I live here now in Ottawa, but this first project took place in London, Ontario, down here, and the second project over here near Toronto, Ontario. And just to illustrate how many different school boards there are, I think there are over 30 school boards in Ontario. And again, each school board has some control over how to implement the curriculum set by the province. One thing I want to mention too that was crucial to these projects is that a lot of the big school boards in Ontario, so all the ones I've worked with here, have their own research departments. And I think that is a really key aspect to facilitating the projects I'm talking about. They wouldn't have been possible without the help of researchers that work in the school boards. And just to illustrate another potential difference between Canada and Mexico is that this is what it looks like outside of my window today. So this project was done in partnership with the Thames Valley District School Board in London, Ontario. The lab I did my postdoc in, the Numerical Cognition Lab, has worked to build a relationship with that school board over many years. And when this project was proposed, the school board identified some schools within their board that were most in need of math help. And actually, this project was pre-registered on the Open Science Framework. I've posted the link at the bottom. But what we wanted to test was whether doing professional development and again, co-designing these activities with educators would improve math achievement among students in schools that were not doing as well as other schools in the board. And so the school's research office identified 3 schools. And so in the first year, we had the school we did the intervention in. And so 15 educators participated and 52 of their students. And these were teachers who taught kindergarten to grade 2. And then there was a control school that did business as usual. And from the school, we had 9 teachers participate and 55 of their students. Then the second year we did the project, we did the intervention in the school that had previously been the control school. And then we had a third school serve as a control group for that year. And so what was amazing about this project is we did 5 full days of continuing professional development with the participating educators at these schools. And we focus on things like numerical skills, number space mapping, mental arithmetic. And so we had the teachers and the students do several measures both before and after the professional development intervention. And so the teachers filled out surveys on things like their comfort level teaching math and their own level of math anxiety. They also filled out a quiz we made called the Numerical Cognition Quiz that tested their knowledge of terms used in this research area, and another one related to sort of cognitive developmental neuroscience more broadly. And then the students completed a bunch of cognitive measures, including measures of their number knowledge, their arithmetic. So this was the key math as a standardized math assessment used in Canada. And as well as measures of their general cognitive skills, like executive functions. And so for each of the 5 professional development days, the structure was like this. First thing in the morning, there would be a research presentation done by myself or one of my colleagues to focus on research that related to the topic of that day. So for example, one week we talked about executive functions, and another week we talked about the home numeracy environment. And then we'd asked the teachers to read research articles, which is a bit difficult for them. And then we discussed the articles together and talked about whether and how that the research reported in the articles might relate to their own practice. Then the teachers worked together to design different activities based on the research, and then this is the fun part, invite students into where we were doing the PD to try to test the activities out with their students and see how their students did. And then we did math together. We talked a lot about how students think about math, and then designed and implemented activities and lessons to then go back for the teachers to try out in their classrooms. And so the key features were, again, this 5 full days of professional development, which is really different than normal continuing professional development in Ontario, where teachers usually go to sort of a one-day thing and they listen to a lecture. There's no kind of follow-up. The other key thing was it allowed for teacher degrees of freedom. And so importantly, we didn't just tell teachers what they should do in their classroom. We told them about the research and sort of gave them the freedom to think about how it could work within their own classrooms. We did a lot of math. We really shared knowledge between teachers and researchers and talked a lot about student thinking. And again, even this idea of sharing knowledge between teachers is something that's not done a lot in Ontario. I know, for example, in Singapore, teachers have something called white space that's built into their schedules where they have time to get together with their other teachers and sort of discuss things that are working in their classroom or things they're struggling with, which is really valuable, but not all school boards allow for this kind of work. And so that was another aspect of our PD that was helpful, even for the teachers to just learn from each other. So I'm going to show you a clip of an example of a teacher exploring their students' mathematical understanding. And I want to know what you think, so you can write reactions in the chat.
Do you remember when Mr. Herbert told you 0 went on a number line?
Yeah.
Okay, where? Can you point to where 0 goes? Excellent. And where does 10 go? And how old are you? 5? So where does 5 go? Right there? Why there? Why does 5 go there?
And 5 is always in the middle.
You said you were good. So far, you're great. How old is Annabelle?
8.
She's 8. Where does 8 go on the number line? Right there? Okay, I'm going to ask you a grade 2 question. Are you ready? If you're 5 and Annabelle is 8, do you know how many ticks you need in between or how many more? You can use the block if you want, or you can use the pencil to draw ticks. Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm getting excited. How many? 3. So Annabelle is 3 years older than you? Yes.
Does anyone have any reactions to that? Anything they noticed? Well, one thing I noticed is that the student said 5 is always in the middle. And so one thing we hypothesized is that teachers use a lot of number lines with anchors of 0 and 10. And so students almost overlearn that representation and sort of, 5 wouldn't be in the middle of a number line from 0 to 20. And so this strategy might not always work. And so one thing, once the teachers noticed this, is they designed a lot of activities that use different anchors for number lines. So here are some examples of the activities that they designed inspired by the professional development. And so this is a number line from 0 to 30. And so what this teacher did is when her students would come in for class in the morning, they would see a number line just with the anchors, so 0 and 30, and these would be hidden, the numbers and the ticks in between. And so in this case, the number was 22, and students had to guess or sort of put where they thought 22 went on the line. And these are the initials of all the students. And then once everyone had put their initials where they thought 22 went on the line, the teacher showed the actual numbers so that they could see how close they were. So this is an example of using different benchmarks or anchors on the number line to sort of inspire more flexible representations of number. And then For the earlier years, a lot of the activities that teachers designed really focused on multiple representations of numbers, so symbolic, the written digits, and non-symbolic, or the collections of quantities. So in this case, the child is writing the numbers and then putting the equivalent number of dots. There's even some ordering involved in this activity as well. And so the teachers in the first school we worked in really helpfully collected all of the activities they designed throughout the professional development and put them together in these handy little booklets for all the participating teachers. And we asked the teachers if what they've learned about research and the science of learning influenced their teaching practice. And I really like this quote from a teacher who participated, saying that, "I think when you bring those students in and those teachers are working with their own students and making those observations that are so powerful," and saying, "I never thought about that, I forgot to think about that, I think our teachers become researchers, and that becomes very powerful." So a lot of the teachers said overall that having the chance to really try out different assessments and activities with their students to explore their students' mathematical thinking was really helpful for them to get a better idea of how their students were developing in their math learning than you might get on a standard math test, where you just look at whether students got the answers right or wrong. We did sort of clinical interview style assessments like you saw in the video, where teachers got to ask follow-up questions and really explore their students' thinking. And so when we looked at the results, we found for the teacher surveys that the teachers that participated in the professional development improved more on the numerical cognition knowledge measure compared to the control school educators, but we didn't see any evidence of improvements in sort of their comfort levels teaching math or their math anxiety. And when we looked at the student results on the cognitive measures, we found that students in the school that had done the intervention did better on the key math numeration compared to the students in the control school, and on a measure of mental arithmetic. And so, but we didn't see any evidence of improvements in more basic numerical skills or in other cognitive skills like spatial reasoning and executive function skills, which suggests that the results are very specific to the content covered in the PD. But then when we did this intervention again in the school that was the control school the first year, we did the professional development with them the second year, we found that they didn't show as many improvements as the teachers and students in the first school we did the intervention in. And so one thing I'm really interested in looking at going forward is to look at individual differences in teachers' development. I think a lot of people have made this argument in education, and we need to move away from asking like what works to asking how it works, because clearly our intervention works in some contexts, but not all contexts. And we thought there's likely group differences in the teacher and school leadership uptake and engagement. And one piece of evidence we have for this is we also asked the participating teachers to keep learning logs and kind of write down which activities they did in their classroom that had been designed in the professional development, and note how long they spent doing them. And so we found that the year one teachers spent about 12 hours over the course of the project doing intervention activities with their students, but the year two teachers spent only about 3 hours. So that suggests that potentially, the first year, the teachers that participated in the first year implemented the intervention more, like used the activities more, and that would be why they saw improvements in that school, but not the second school. It's also important to keep in mind the alignment between teacher and researcher goals. The teachers in the second school were happy to get professional development around math learning, but they sort of made a few comments that suggested that they would have appreciated also other kinds of professional development. And in particular, teachers mentioned that in the second school, despite the fact that these schools were chosen to be well matched on the demographics of their students, the teachers in the second school seem to be dealing with more behavioral challenges from their students or mental health challenges. And so they sort of suggested that, the math learning was nice, but that they also really needed help around mental health and behavior management with their students as well. And so it's possible that they weren't as keen to learn about math at that stage in their teaching practice. And so I'll pause there in case there are any questions about that specific project.
Rebecca, I have a question. I would like to know, how do you select the information that was presented to the teachers? I mean, the research that
Yeah,
you
that's a great
presented to them.
question. So Zach Haas led on the project his PhD work, and he picked the main topics he wanted to discuss. So again, we focused on number knowledge, mental arithmetic and strategies, and then executive functions and a few other things. But basically, it's almost like when I teach a class in university, like I was given a topic, and if I was the one presenting, I sort of just picked the stuff that I thought was most relevant. So there's potentially some bias there, but it wasn't super systematic. It was more, although I will say one thing, a lot of the stuff we talked about was things like Rochelle Gelman's counting principles. So a lot of really older research from like kind of the 80s and 90s, because that's one thing we see in the kind of research and education gap, is that researchers are constantly arguing amongst themselves. And so it's really hard to know when we have enough evidence for something that we want to tell teachers about it. And so we tried to stick to things that we thought were pretty established findings in the field, which oftentimes meant going back to kind of, some of Bob Siegler's work from the early 90s, or again, Gelman's in the 80s, like older work that's had a long time to be tested.
Okay, perfect. And in this line of research that you presented, have you considered some, I don't know, maybe some research papers about math, but using some, for example, application in science or another field that use mathematics?
Yeah, we definitely should. It's interesting that we teach science and math so separately, at least in Ontario. I don't know if it's like that in Mexico, but it would definitely be good to look at the overlap. But we haven't done that yet.
Perfect. So we invite the people that were watching to ask questions, but you can continue if we can receive it.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so, and then this is another project that was done in partnership with the school board. And so in the previous project, we approached the school board with an idea. But in this case, it was the opposite. So a school board near Toronto came to us because, as I said, the Ministry of Education sets the standards for math education, but don't always tell school boards or teachers, exactly how to meet those standards. And so the school board's curriculum and special education staff were really interested in early math in particular, and finding a way to identify students' mathematical ability at an early age, and then support these students and support the kindergarten educators in providing intentional, focused mathematical learning opportunities, particularly for students that might be at risk of falling behind their peers. And so they really wanted to make sure they were catching kids in early education and setting them up with strong foundations for math, but they didn't have a way to determine or monitor children's number knowledge ability from an early age. And so they came to the Numerical Cognition Lab and then asked whether we'd have any tools or any suggestions for how they could do this in their early years classrooms. So one thing we thought of is this task called the give a number task that's used a lot in math cognition research. And in this task, the researcher has a puppet, and the puppet asks children to give them sets of objects. So for example, here the dinosaur, they ask for 3 objects. The child would have to put 3 and exactly 3 blocks in front of the dinosaur. And research using this task has shown that children learn numbers sequentially. And so a child is classified as a pre-knower if they don't yet know their numbers. And so a child that doesn't know what 3 means, when asked for 3 objects, will just give a handful. And then a child that has learned the word 1 will give 1 object when asked for sets of 1, but not be able to give accurate sets for the higher numbers. 2-knower can give up to 2 accurately, 3-knower up to 3, 4, etc. And then so there's some debate in the research as to when a child becomes a cardinal principal knower, which understands the counting principle that the last number used when counting sets of objects denotes the total number of objects in the set. But most researchers think that by the time a child can do this for about 5, they've learned this and can generalize this knowledge to all numbers. And then the Numerical Cognition Lab has worked a lot on a measure called the numeracy screener. And actually, I should explain, in Ontario, We now have what's called full day kindergarten, and so this is the first year of formal education. And it's made up of 4-year-olds who are in junior kindergarten or the first year, and 5-year-olds that are in senior kindergarten or the second year, but they're mixed in the same class. And so we thought the give a number task would be good for the students in their first year of kindergarten. So the youngest kids just starting school for the first time, and then this numeracy screener would be good for the second year kindergarten students who hopefully have a bit more knowledge about numbers and symbols in particular. It's important to note too that the screener is not necessarily meant to be a diagnostic tool, so it's not looking for kids that have a specific learning difficulty per se, but it's really meant as a measure of potential strengths and difficulties among students. And so we had them do 2 tasks from this screener. So this is a number comparison task where children had to cross out the larger of 2 numbers, and then an ordering task where they had to decide if a sequence of numbers was in order or not. And then we also did some spatial tasks. So this shape composition task, children had to pick which of the 4 targets you would get if you imagined compressing these shapes. So in this case, it would be this diamond. And then this mental rotation task, which was a bit confusing because they actually had to pick 2 of the 4 targets that were in the same orientation as the zebra. So in this case, it would be these 2. And so when we started this project, we had several aims. We wanted to establish a partnership between the school board and the research team at the University of Western Ontario. And we wanted to evaluate educators' experiences with using the assessments and using the results to inform their teaching, and also to see whether there's anything we could do to improve the assessment tools. And so we'd actually used, or the lab rather, had used this tool with many school boards before, but we've never done research to ask educators if they thought they were useful for their own practice. Like, the results were always used for research in the lab. And so we had a few questions for the participating educators. And the school board's research project team. So again, this is where it was really key to have researchers who worked in the school board to help facilitate this collaboration. So they outlined a theory of action that would help meet students' learning needs, and then planned an approach to introducing and studying the sample of kindergarten classrooms and getting feedback from the teachers in those classrooms. So 8 pilot schools participated in the first year, and the participating teachers were asked what their perceptions were of implementing the give a number task in the numeracy screener, whether the screeners were effective in identifying specific needs of students, and how did they use the results to inform their instruction. So we did some in-service training with the teachers. This was just 1 session, not 5 like the previous project, but I went to give a talk, and other members of the lab did as well, about some of the research behind these tools. And then the teachers were specifically trained on how to administer the assessments. They then went to their classrooms and did the assessments with all of their students. And so 25 classes and 54 educators participated in total in the first year. So that was 370 junior kindergarten students and 340 senior kindergarten students. And then the data was scored and the results were given to the teachers. And then the curriculum staff at the school board also did more training with the teachers to give them activities to use in the classrooms to help support number learning. And so these are some examples of those activities. For the spatial skills, activities were taken from this book called Taking Shape, and so there are activities around geometric and spatial thinking. This is a card game called Tiny Polka Dots that, again, links symbolic and non-symbolic representations of number. They did some number comparison tasks and then some more patterning tasks as well. So the curriculum staff of the school board are really important for facilitating activities and giving teachers things they could use in the classroom. And so here are the results of the educator survey. So only 17 educators responded, which is about a 60% response rate. And it was clear that they gave a number task, identified around 20% of the students that were not cardinal principle knowers at the start of school. And then the numeracy screener we looked at the students who scored in the bottom 20% of students. And so most teachers found that the screeners were pretty useful for identifying students' mathematical needs. I'll say too, we couldn't use the data from the mental rotation task, so that was the animal task where they had to pick 2 targets, and it's not clear, perhaps they didn't really understand the instructions or that task was just too difficult for kids at this age, but the other 3 numeracy screener tasks were useful for identifying students' math knowledge. And so yeah, most of the educators found that they were useful, and so we also asked some open-ended questions. And as I said, the educators found the tools easy to administer, but that the students struggled with some of the numeracy screener challenges. And here's a quote from a teacher saying that they use the results to set out provocations and activities for these students to help them build their skills and hit targeted goals throughout the term. So many of the educators said that once they had the results from the screeners and sort of knew which students might need more help with learning their numbers, they were then able to use the activities to target those students and raise their number knowledge. So going forward, actually, the school board found that using this numeracy screener in paper format was challenging, both for the students using a paper and pencil assessment, because children these days are actually more familiar with tablets in Ontario, but also because it was paper and pencil, it was a lot of work for the school board research office to score the assessment. And so what they've done is they've adapted it for their own use to use a tablet, which is great because the kids like it better, and then the teachers get the results right away. And so the lab might also incorporate some of the teacher feedback in future versions of the numeracy screener. The lab has thought about making it a tablet app, but they use it a lot in cross-cultural research, and so paper pencil is really important for countries that might not have access to tablets and internet. So that again highlights the different goals sometimes of research versus practice. But overall, this project was a success, showing that collaborating with a school board and a research lab can lead to this kind of applied insight that might be useful for schools and to support early math learning. So I'll pause again in case there are any questions about that project.
Yes, thank you, Rebecca. I have a question from Paola that maybe is more related to the first one, but we have a delay in the transmission, about 20 seconds. So I'm going to ask you now. Paola is a student of mine in the psychology department, and she's asking if you have or there's any good intervention with the students since young that can be able to, when they grow up, to face less anxiety in mathematics.
Oh, that's a really good question. There isn't a lot of longitudinal research yet, but sort of based more on my intuitions, one thing we talked about actually with the teachers in both projects is that teachers' attitudes really influence student attitudes. And in particular, a lot of the teachers we worked with said that they feel anxious about math, and they sort of accidentally sometimes pass those attitudes on to their students. And there's really interesting research from Aaron Maloney and others from the University of Chicago showing this effect, that actually if a teacher is math anxious, their students are more likely to then be math anxious. And one thing, some of the teachers I've worked with said is, at least in Ontario, I don't know about Mexico, it's sort of, people will say things like, I'm not a math person, in a way that, I would never say I'm not, I can't read well, or I'm not good at reading. And so it's almost like a social, cultural thing where I think just society's attitudes toward, math being a hard thing, or math being something that mathematicians do, but not something that everyone does, contribute to math anxiety. And so actually in the video clip I showed, because we talked about the importance of attitudes, the teacher at the beginning asked the student, are you a good mathematician or a great mathematician? And to kind of just prompt this idea that, all kids can do math. And so a lot of the teachers we worked with then have tried to do that in their classrooms, but I don't have any evidence to say if that actually works long-term. I just sort of think that if teachers are more confident in their attitudes towards math, that it could help their students.
Yes, perfect. And I have a question about this research that you mentioned in now. How can be applied for now? We have the moment in the pandemic with the COVID-19 that all the teaching, well, here in Mexico at least, is online, and the students have to take. Well, here in Mexico we have two options: to have the classes on internet or have the classes in the television. The government established this program with the main television. Companies, and they have these programs in the morning during the television. How can your research can be applied for these scenarios in the online teaching?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know about my research in particular, but there's a lot of research around kind of early math activities, or even things like reading math storybooks can help with kids' number knowledge. And so some research teams have been designing books that have these different representations of number. So, for example, the character in the storybook might, go to a shop and buy 4 apples, and the illustration has 4. And so making these links between the symbols and the quantities is really important in the early years, and that's something I think you could do in a kind of broadcasting situation, right? But yeah, a lot of the stuff we've been doing it really is kind of one-on-one teacher-student assessment, and I personally don't know how to do that online. Actually, in Ontario, most of our schools are still open. So I'm teaching online for university. All universities are online, and even some secondary school. But our government's decided that it's really important for the youngest kids to be in school, because for 2 reasons: so that their parents can go to work, but also so that they get that really important interaction with their teachers and their peers.
Okay, perfect. And Paula asked another question that is a little bit more general, if you want to answer now and or at the end. She's asking, what do you consider to be necessary to be a good teacher in mathematics in these levels?
Oh, I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that. I think, and so one thing I'm interested in is kind of how teachers think of themselves as professionals and as how they think of themselves as learners, right? So I think, to me, a good teacher is someone that is open to continuously learning new things, or like trying new things, and also, again, kind of encouraging all of their students to reach their full potential. But that's just my opinion.
Okay, perfect. You can continue, and we can keep still receiving some questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I'm just going to wrap up by kind of trying to summarize some themes of my research. And so, as I mentioned, I'm really interested in investigating these individual differences in teachers as learners going forward. So I'd like to continue to do this kind of work with educators, looking at how we can support early math learning based on both teachers' expertise and insights from cognitive science research. I'd also like to continue to co-design and evaluate activities that support the development of cognitive skills and math with early childhood educators. And actually, luckily, just got a grant to do this in England. Building on the project I mentioned at the start, we're going to actually do some professional development with some of the preschools we've worked with previously, and work to design activities that target both early math learning and also executive functions in preschool classrooms. And I think, this is a problem everywhere. Like, I talk to people all over the world where, you have researchers working at universities studying cognitive development, and you have teachers in the classroom, and they don't really talk together or work together. And so I think it would benefit education and research everywhere to have better ways of connecting teachers and researchers and having more integration between teaching and research. And so one thing we've been doing recently is connecting researchers and educators with a podcast that's on Voice Ed Radio here in Canada. And we called the podcast On the Right Track because in the field of neuroscience and education and other education research, we often talk about having to bridge a research practice gap. But we find this bridge metaphor lacking in some way. For instance, who is supposed to build this bridge, and how, and where are the teachers and researchers supposed to meet? Do they meet in the middle, or does one cross over to the other? And so my collaborator, Pat McLeod, who's an educator, now vice principal here in Ontario, and the host of this podcast, came up with this railroad metaphor. And it's to illustrate that researchers and educators have shared goals of advancing student learning. And so we argue that teachers and researchers make up opposite separate rails because they work in parallel. but don't often intersect in their professional lives. And so we therefore need railroad ties to link these rails of research and practice. And so the collaborative projects I discussed are one example of something that can act as a tie. But this metaphor and podcast are very much works in progress. And as it stands, researchers and educators still often talk past each other, like two trains passing in the night. And this is nicely illustrated in this table from a paper by Dan Birch, where he showed how sometimes the same term is used in very different ways by cognitive psychologists and math education researchers. So for example, in cognition, core knowledge is a theory that certain cognitive capacities are present at birth, whereas in math education, the Common Core is a set of controversial education standards in the US. Moreover, cognitive research focuses on internal mental representations of number, whereas math education looks at external representations such as manipulatives and how they scaffold math learning. So Birch argued that there are fundamental disconnects in the theory and methods of these two disciplines, and part of the tension is emphasis on quantitative versus qualitative research, but both are necessary. And so when researchers step outside of the laboratory and interact with people rather than just data, the interpretation of the research can change. And there are examples of transdisciplinary research that integrates neurocognitive research with equity in school mathematics that I want to flag. So here are two examples of articles from math education researchers that engage with evidence from cognitive neuroscience and suggest that it could inform ways to improve instruction for diverse learners in the early years. I wanted to flag too, and actually you mentioned it in the introduction, that I've worked for an American initiative called the EF Plus Math Program. And it's investing in inclusive research and development team. And so they bring together teams of researchers, developers, and educators to co-design math instruction tools that integrate executive function and math. And they really want to, in particular, raise math achievement in middle school age children in the US from communities that have been historically underserved. And so there are resources on their website, including a list of suggested readings about equity, math education, and learning sciences that actually I can share at the end. Oh, it's on my slide. And so these are examples, again, of how math education researchers have read some of the cognitive neuroscience research and started to think about how it can be used to advance equity in math education. But while there's a small flow of information from psych and neuro into math education, psychologists and neuroscientists are less likely to cite research from math education. And so this picture shows the results of a citation analysis that these researchers did, looking at spatial reasoning and how it's discussed and cited in journals from these 4 different disciplines. As you can see, mathematics is hanging out here on its own, although here we have a particle physicist that's engaging in math and psychology research. But in order to solve some of these problems, we need more talk across all of these fields. And so to quote the authors of this paper, ultimately we argue a more pronounced emphasis on transdisciplinary research might be timely and perhaps even necessary in the evolution of educational research. And so they define transdisciplinary approaches as inquiries that seek to integrate diverse expertise from across domains, like those papers I just mentioned. And so we need to address these gaps across research disciplines as well as that gap between research and practice. And furthermore, not all research is even relevant to the classroom, and so there needs to be some kind of intermediary step to determine whether and how research can inform teaching practice. And so these are the questions we've been trying to discuss on this podcast. It's actually sort of on hiatus with COVID right now, but we'd love to hear from any of you that are interested to join the conversation. So please get in touch if you'd like to be a guest or have an idea for a topic. I just wanted to end by saying that, unlike reading, math, it's, a universal language in the sense that most countries use the same number symbols. And so my long-term goal is to use insights from the science of learning to improve early education globally. And I'm luckily enough privileged to be a co-investigator or collaborator on complementary early education and numeracy projects in Canada, the United Kingdom, Chile, South Africa, and Singapore, which allows me to study child development across diverse geographies, cultures, and levels of economic development. And so I'm really excited to see what we'll find in all of these projects and to work together internationally to improve early math education. So thank you so much again for inviting me. And I wanted to thank all the wonderful people I work with, the Numerical Cognition Lab at Western, the Math Lab here at Carleton, and then I did my PhD in the ABCD Lab at Oxford. And thank you to all the wonderful people that fund this research.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Rebecca, for this very interesting talk. I think it's a very, very nice topic, as I mentioned at the beginning. So I would like to ask some question, and I also to invite the people that are watching the transmission to ask some question on the chat. But I have a question, Rebecca, and you let me thinking about in this last part that you mentioned about this transdisciplinary research that could be very, very great for these kind of opportunities. So let me mention, we are doing some research with my student in the education and the master's degree education mathematics program at the science and physics and mathematics department. And we are trying to do some research about problem solving in geometry and using some EEG data. So my question is, how can a teacher be benefit from the research that the people are doing in neuroscience, in neurocognitive science? How can be apply in the classroom?
Yeah, that's a tough question that lots of people ask. And so that, again, it's those papers I cited from Natalie Sinclair. I think in order to be applied to a classroom, we really need to consult with educators in pedagogy, right? Like, I'm a cognitive neuroscientist by training, but without knowing what teachers do in the classroom, it's really hard to know how the results can be useful. And so my thinking on this now is that, as you know, we do research in cognitive neuroscience, we have to share our findings in ways that teachers can understand them. That's part of the problem, right? Is we write these papers that, first of all, are behind a paywall in a journal, so many people can't access them. But even if they can get the paper, they're written in such a jargony way that they might not be able to understand them. So I think there's things like the BOLD blog from the Jacobs Foundation, which is the blog on learning and development. And that's a place where researchers try to write about their research in a way that can be read by a wide audience. And so then I think, you know, hopefully educators or school leadership might read about these findings, and then they can decide whether or how it can be used in the classroom. Or, you know, we could ideally have more partnerships where, and some labs are doing this, you know, you can do EEG in the classroom, or, you know, try your experiments in the lab at first, and then to see if they apply in the classroom, to then do work in classrooms, I think is an important step, because the lab is very different from a classroom.
Yeah, for sure. And how about the research? Going back to the research that you present, well, I think that some of the teachers might also have involved in doing the research, not only, for example, reading the research. What do you think about this? How do you get involved, the teachers, in getting, I don't know, the hands out in the research business?
Yeah, well, it seems like you do that in your department, but it depends on the school. So actually, at my university, we don't have an education department. We don't have anyone training to be teachers, which is disappointing. There's another university in my city that does, and I've been hoping to make connections with them. But I think some people have argued that having courses in teacher training that talk about neuroscience research will be useful. And then, you know, those teachers who are interested could volunteer in labs to get some of the experience doing the research, or even maybe do like a master's thesis. And that would be a great way to get teachers involved in research. But that's the point I mentioned about sort of needing infrastructure for this, because currently teachers don't get, the teachers that are in service don't have any time to do research, and they certainly wouldn't have any money. So it needs to come, there needs to be more policy changes to facilitate it, I think.
Okay, perfect. And I would like to ask you, and maybe Paola is also interested in this. She's been working with the special education kids. So how can some methods can be applied for the special education kids?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the numeracy screener I mentioned has been used in the project I mentioned to sort of just look at all of the kids and see where they fall on the continuum. But Stephanie Bugden did a lot of her research on kids with dyscalculia, so a specific math learning disorder. And she's used it, and she's found that it's actually pretty good at identifying kids with dyscalculia compared to kids that aren't, or sorry, that don't have dyscalculia. And so that's one way that tool can be used. One thing that Stephanie has done in her research that's really important is a lot of researchers categorize kids with a math learning difficulty based on just one assessment time point. But what Stephanie has done, she's done a lot of longitudinal work where she's looked at children a couple of times, and she'll find, some kids score in the bottom percentiles one time, but then they're fine at other times. So you wouldn't necessarily diagnose this kid with a learning difficulty. But whereas what she calls persistent difficulties, so kids that consistently score on the bottom of the screener, then do tend to have a diagnosis of dyscalculia. So she's done a lot of work looking at how this tool can be used to identify kids with learning difficulties. But then in terms of how to help, I think a lot about sort of inclusive education. And one quote I like is, some things are necessary for some students that need extra support, but like beneficial for all. And so a lot of the things that we do in classrooms can be used for kids with learning difficulties as well, and vice versa. Interventions designed for kids with learning difficulties could benefit all students. And so I don't necessarily think of them as different in the way I do my research.
Perfect. Andrea said that this was a very super interesting talk, and Paula just said to me that she's going to ask that I already asked you. So I took an advance, but thank you very much. And Rebecca, well, we are getting closer to the end, and thank you very much for this great talk. And I would like to ask you for a message for my students, for the students that are listening to this talk, that they're interested in doing some research in this area of learning in mathematics, in science, in literacy, I don't know, but they're interested also in this important thing that is the mathematics, as you mentioned, as a universal language all around the world, and that is very important for many careers and many other fields in life, not only in the university. So what could be your final message for them that they're interested in this area?
I think my best advice is, if you want to do this kind of research that might be useful for math teachers, and if many of you are psychology students, is to become friends with teachers. I think having someone you can ask about whether your research relates to the things they're doing in their classroom is really useful and important. And so Pat McLeod, who I mentioned, we did the podcast together, that's been hugely useful. It was introduced by a mutual friend a few years ago, and it's just really great. If I have a hypothesis about cognitive science, and I think, early year students will behave a certain way, I mentioned my research design, he'll come back and say, well, as a teacher, I think you might be wrong. And so I think it's really important to be able just to have conversations with teachers and people that have different experiences from you. But I also want to flag that if you're specifically interested in math cognition and learning, I should have put it on my slides, but the International Mathematical Cognition and Learning Society conference, it was going to be in Dublin in July or June of this year, but obviously that didn't happen. And so they are doing online sessions every week. And so you can join live, or they're also posting the recordings on YouTube. And I'm pretty sure it's free for students to join the society this year. And so if you're interested just in kind of getting involved in an international network of people interested in math cognition and learning, I highly recommend joining.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Rebecca. And a final question from Andrea, that is maybe in a overall kind of sense. How do you make the research to go to the practice, to the classroom? How do you approach the research in that arena?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, like I said, the second project I talked about, the school board came to us. And so I think in some ways, researchers have different kinds of questions than teachers do. And so sometimes the questions we have might not be of interest or even of use to teachers. And so I think asking teachers what their questions are is really helpful for bringing it to the classroom, because then you'll know that getting teachers involved, even when you're designing your study, helps make sure that it lines up with the questions they have and the things they're doing in their practice.
Okay, perfect. And Rebecca, thank you very much for this great opportunity. As I said at the beginning, I found your research very interesting and very relevant for now, the moment that we are living also, but also because I really enjoy doing research in this area of teaching mathematics and learning. And thank you very much, Rebecca. I hope you have a good time with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for listening. And this is so great that you have this international seminar as well. Very cool.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and thank you very much again. Because I would like to keep in touch with you in order maybe for a future, a near future, hopefully, collaboration, and also for our students maybe to go to visit you there and have some research stay for you. I know if you can comment a little bit about if the possibilities in the future that could be possible.
Yeah, so Joanne Lefebvre, I don't know if you know her work. She's actually at the same university as me, and she's worked with people from Mexico before and Chile, and so we often have visiting students in the lab. It would be very welcome. I don't know about funding. So I think in many cases people get funding from their home universities. I don't know if we have funding to support students, but I could look into it too.
Okay, perfect. And thank you very much, Rebecca, again for this great opportunity. I enjoyed a lot your talk. So thank you very much for the nice topic. And I would like to invite all the people that are watching us to our next seminar next week, the final of the second season. I want to put it on the screen with Dr. Clotilde Gonzalez on the boundaries of instance-based learning theory for explaining decision for experience, December 17th, 12 p.m. at Central Dead Time. So you are invited also, Rebecca, to join us. And thank you very much again, Rebecca, for this great opportunity. Thank you very much for all the people that are connected now and for all the questions. And be safe, and we see in the next seminar. Thank you very much. I'm going to close the broadcast now, but I'm going to stay with Rebecca for a couple of minutes only to say goodbye. Thank you very much, and have a good day.